Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum, dear participants. Welcome to this session of Meezan study series. So this is a session in which we study Ustaz Javed Ahmed Ghamidi's book Meezan, which is actually his understanding of the contents of Islam. These days we are studying one of the preambles of his book, which is called Fundamental Principles. And in this preamble, he has actually discussed the fundamental principles of understanding the sources of Islam, the Quran and the Sunnah, as well as the nature of the sources themselves. Also found in this preamble is a whole section on understanding Hadith. So in our previous sessions, we have covered three points in these principles. So there are 10 principles which are outlined by Ustaz Ghamidi regarding the principles of understanding Islam. So if you can just recall, we have done appreciation of classical Arabic, eloquence of language, uniqueness of style. And today we'll start off with the fourth fundamental principle, which is the nature of the Quran as the final authority. Now the Quran is a Meezan. It calls itself a Meezan, which means a scale that tells you good from evil. And it is also a Furqan, which is again a name of the Quran. And it literally means something which distinguishes between good and evil. Similarly, it also calls itself Muhaymin, a guardian. And this, of course, is referring to its status over other previous divine scriptures. So it is like a guardian over them. And the Quran has actually, as I said, invested a status upon himself in these verses. If you can just see these verses being displayed before you. Allahu allazi anzala al-kitaba bil-haqqi wal-mizan. It is God who has revealed with truth the book, and in this way revealed his scale that distinguishes between good and evil. So clearly this is something which has to be understood, but perhaps one thing that needs clarification in this verse is that the particle vav is for explication. So Allahu allazi anzala al-kitaba bil-haqq actually is a statement, and the vav right after that is explaining the word book as Meezan. So the word al-Meezan is actually used to connote al-kitab. The verse means that the Almighty has revealed the Quran, which is a scale of justice meant to distinguish good from evil. People can judge good and evil through it. It is the only scale that weighs everything else, and there is no scale in which it can be weighed. Similarly, it has also called itself Furqan in Surah Furqan. Of course, the surah itself is called Al-Furqan, and verse number 1, it says, تَبَارَكَ الَّذِي نَزَّلَ الْفُرْقَانَ عَلَىٰ عَبْدِهِ لِيَكُونَ لِلْعَالَمِينَ نَظِيرًا. Very exalted and blessed is he who has revealed Al-Furqan to his servant so that it may warn the whole world. Again, you can see that the Quran, as it calls itself Al-Furqan, it is in the same sense. It's a book which is the final and absolute verdict in distinguishing truth from falsehood. This word also connotes the fact that this book is the standard on which everything needs to be judged and is a decisive word on matters which relate to religion. Everyone must turn to it only to resolve differences of opinion. And of course, these differences relate to differences that arise in religion. So nothing can be a judge on it. It shall reign supreme in the dominion of religion and divine guidance, and every person is bound not to make it subservient to anything else. As we have also said that another name which the Quran invests with upon itself is Al-Muhaymin. So this Quranic name is spelled out in the verse that I'm just now going to read before you. It says, وَأَنزَلْنَا إِلَيْكَ الْكِتَابَ بِالْحَقِّ مُصَدِّقًا لِمَا بَيْنَ يَدَيْهِ مِنَ الْكِتَابِ وَمُهَيْمِنًا عَلَيْهِ فَاحْكُمْ بَيْنَهُمْ بِمَا أَنزَلَ اللَّهُ وَلَا تَتَّبِعْ أَهْوَاءَهُمْ عَمَّا جَاءَكَ مِنَ الْحَقِّ. Then, O Prophet, we have revealed to you this book with truth in confirmation of the book before it, and standing as a guardian over it. Therefore give judgment among them according to the guidance revealed by God, and do not yield to their whims by swerving from the truth which has been revealed to you. So these three verses clearly define the authority of the Quran. And if you look at this word, the word which is used here is Muhaymin, and it is actually an adjective from the words haymana falanun ala kaza, which means a guardian and a protector. And in the verse that we have just read, the Quran has been regarded as a muhaymin on the previous scriptures. What does this mean? It means that the Quran is the real and authentic, trustworthy version of the Book of God. Thus, when the texts of other scriptures were lost to posterity and their translations were greatly tampered with, it was this Quran which was reposed with the status of judging between the right and wrong of those scriptures. Whatever it judges to be right is right, and whatever it judges to be wrong is wrong, and must necessarily be rejected. This is the status of the Quran which it has asserted about its own self. And on the basis of its status, there are some principles that have to be adhered to. And I would like to point out those principles the way Ustaz Ghamidi has pointed them out. So first thing that has been stated by him is that no divine revelation absolutely whatsoever, extraneous to the Quran, and not even Prophet Muhammad himself, to whom this Quran was revealed, can specify a general directive of the Quran or alter any of its directives. Such is the authority of the Quran that no human being on earth can in any way specify a general directive of the Quran or alter any of its directives. Everything shall be accepted as religion or rejected that it is not on the basis of the Quran. Everything accepted in religion shall be rigorously scrutinized under the light of this divine guidance. All basis of belief and faith shall be directly derived from it. Every revelation, inspiration, research, opinion, call it what you may, shall be subservient to the Quran, and it shall be acknowledged that even the works of great outstanding authorities like Abu Hanifa and Shafi'i, who are of course two tremendous scholars of jurisprudence, scholars of hadith like Bukhari and Muslim, theologians like Ash'ari and Maturidi, Sufis like Junaid and Shibli, regardless how high a status or stature may a person command, their works must be weighed in the scales of this Meezan, and nothing can be accepted from them which is not in harmony with the Quran. So this is the first point that Ustaz Ghamidi has drawn as a conclusion. The second thing that he has stated here is that the text of the Quran is univocal. What does this mean? It means that the meaning conveyed by each word of it is definitive. Whatever it intends to say, it says with full certainty, and there is no ambiguity about it. In no issue is it unable to convey what it wants to. The meanings of its words perfectly match the words, and the meanings do not in any way contradict what the words say. The only way to approach the Quran, in order to understand it is through its words, because it has been revealed by the Almighty in words. It's not that something that was not in words was inspired to the Prophet and then it was his own version or his own understanding of what was revealed to him that he presented to the Sahaba. No, exact words of the Almighty were reproduced by him. So with full certainty, these words convey what they stand for, and there is no question of any doubt or ambiguity in this regard. And both these things are a natural corollary of the fact that the Quran is Meezan and Furqan. There can be no two opinions about it. But there are certain questions which might arise to create doubts in the minds of certain people in this regard. So now they have to be tackled. So as far as the status of the Quran is concerned, as the Meezan and the Furqan, these two are the natural corollaries, that as far as the Quran is concerned, it shall stand supreme. And secondly, the text is univocal, which means that the meaning conveyed by every word of it is definitive. There is absolutely no doubt of any speculation about what the meaning of a certain word is. Now, as I said, that both these things are a natural corollary of the fact that the Quran is Meezan. But in spite of saying all these words, in our history and in our understanding of Islamic literature and the way it has been presented, there might arise some questions which Ustaz Ghamidi has actually penned down that might actually challenge what we have just said. So, the first question that he has raised, or the first thing that has been penned down by him in this regard, is that there exist at some places differences of reading the Quran. These differences are not only due to a difference in pronouncing words, but at times are also of the sort which affect the meanings they convey. Apparently, there is no decisive thing which on such instances is able to resolve the difference. For example, we know the word arjulakum in verse 5 of Al-Maidah can be read both in the accusative and in the genitive. So arjulakum is the accusative case and arjulekum is the genitive case. And if it is read in the accusative case, of course, it would mean that the feet have to be washed. But if it is read in the genitive case as arjulikum, it would mean that if the feet are wiped with, they're just wiped upon, then that would also suffice for wuzu. So the question arises that if there is this difference of meaning which can cause such a drastic meaning that on the one hand you have to wash the feet, and on the other hand, if you don't wash them and you just wipe them, that is sufficient and that would do as far as ablution or wuzu is concerned. So which of these two is the correct one? So this is one question that might arise in the minds of people, and inshallah we'll see how they are answered by Ustaz Ghamidi, but at the moment we are just enumerating these questions. The second thing that may arise is that we understand from the Quran, what we understand from the Quran is understood from its words and the way which its sentences are constructed. The disciplines on which this understanding is dependent is syntax, which is grammar, which is nahv, morphology, which is of course the knowledge of the words themselves and is called sarf, and lexicography, with the way these words have been recorded in a dictionary. They are not definitive. So it is said that because these disciplines are not definitive, they are zanni, how can it be said that the meanings which convey these words are absolutely certain? So in other words, the question is, how then it can be said that the meanings which words convey are absolutely certain, because syntax, morphology and lexicography themselves are not definitive. Ustaz Ghamidi has said that this version or this viewpoint, the best representative of this viewpoint is Ustaz Imam Razi, and he's actually cited an excerpt from him, and I'm just going to read out that excerpt, which will actually be a very eye-opener in this regard as far as Imam Razi, who is actually a representative of a whole group of scholars, is concerned. So he says, the intentionality of a text is speculative because it is dependent on the transmission of words with their meanings, declensions and inflections. Of course, declensions refers to the Arab and inflections refer to the change in case. Moreover, the transmitters were ahad, and it is acknowledged about such transmitters that what they have transmitted cannot be taken to be totally preserved in its original form. Moreover, determining this intentionality of the text is dependent on the fact that the same word may stand for more than one entity. A word may be used figuratively, a word may have changed its meanings, a word may have been used concisely, a word may have been used without limiting its meaning, or used in contradiction to some logical premise, because if there is such a contradiction, then it is essential that a word be understood to be used figuratively. Undoubtedly, all these premises are accepted because of their speculative nature, and what is based on speculation is all the more speculative. So this whole version or this whole viewpoint of Imam Razi, that the words do not convey a definitive meaning, which is primarily what he's trying to imply, is something that might raise a question in the minds of people, that how can the Quran be a scale, a definitive distinguisher between right and wrong, if the meanings of the words it conveys, they are not definitive. And of course, this is one version or one viewpoint in this regard amongst the scholars of our ummah. Now, in this regard, now we come to the third question or the third issue that can arise, and that is, it has been mentioned in the Quran that some of its verses are muhkam and others are mutashabih, and the Quran itself has specified about the latter that only God knows their meaning. So the Quran says that the mutashabihat verses are verses which only are known to God. Their meaning is only known to God. If this is true, then this strips the Quran of its status of the final judge and authority. So if there are verses in the Quran whose meaning cannot be found out, whose meaning human beings can have no access to, whose meaning is only known to God, then how can we regard the Quran to be a final judge? So if we are not able to distinguish the muhkam from the mutashabih, and are also unable to understand the mutashabih, it would mean that how can we actually determine the true purport of the Quran in these verses, because we just cannot know them. And how can we regard it to be the final authority on the basis of this purport on other things? So the issue of muhkam and mutashabih is also something that has to be understood. So the issue of variant readings, the issue of the words conveying speculative meanings, and now the third issue in which Quran says the muhkam and the mutashabih verses are there, and in the first instance we need to distinguish between muhkam and mutashabih. That could be erroneous. And in the second instance, the Quran says that only God knows the meaning of the mutashabih verses. So if that is the case, then again this actually jeopardizes the status of the Quran as the final authority. Now, fourthly, even more importantly, and last but not the least, there are certain ahadith which seemingly, apparently alter the meaning of the Quran. And when you read those ahadith, we'll do them in the due course of this study. It will become evident to you that their apparent words, they seem to contradict the Quran, and they give a different understanding, as if they are adding or altering the Quran, adding some more meaning to the Quran. And our scholars at some instances, when they see that they have a different purport, these hadiths have a different purport, they call it naskh, which means abrogation, and at others they call it tahdeed, takhsis or taqyeed. All of these are terms which actually refer to the fact that the meaning of the Quran is specified. Now, and the general meaning is specified to a specific addressee or a specific meaning. If this is accepted, then how can the Quran have the status of being the Meezan and the Furqan that we have just read about itself? So these four primary questions actually jeopardize or threaten the stature of the Quran as a final authority. So Ustaz Ghamidi has actually answered these questions one by one, and we will also look at the answers that he has proposed in this regard. So the first answer that he has given, of course, is regarding the first question that was raised, and that was that the Quran has, at some instances, multiple readings or variant readings. And Ustaz Ghamidi, I'm just going to also present a verse, but before I do that, let me also first introduce the whole issue. So he says that the answer to the first question is that the Quran is only what is recorded in the Mus'haf, and which, except from some areas of North Africa, is recited by a vast majority of the Muslim Ummah. A very vast majority of the Muslim Ummah recites the same Quran, except certain areas of North Africa. None else except the reading on which this Quran is recited is the Quran, or can be presented in the capacity and status of the Quran. And therefore, this question does not even arise, which means that a very vast majority of the Quran, barring some areas of North Africa, it is reading this Quran in the same way. There is no difference in the words at all. So Ustaz says that this is something that has to be understood, and then he goes on to explain his whole viewpoint or an answer to this criticism in a more detailed way. So first he cites this verse that is being displayed before you. It says, سَنُقْرِئُكَ فَلَا تَنْسَى إِلَّا مَا شَاءَ اللَّهُ إِنَّهُ يَعْلَمُ الْجَهْرَ وَمَا يَخْفَى. In a similar way, this Quran too will gradually be completed. Then soon we shall recite all of it to you. Then you will not forget except what Allah pleases. He indeed knows what is apparent before you at this time, and that also which is concealed from you. And another verse of the Quran that he cites right after is, actually these are four verses of Surah Qiyamah from 16 to 19, and they are لا تحرك به لسانك لتعجل به إن علينا جمعه وقرآنه فإذا قرأناه فاتبع قرآنه ثم إن علينا بيانه. So his translation, or in fact the translation of his translation, is to swiftly communicate the truth to them in a conclusive manner. O Prophet, do not move your tongue over it to hastily acquire this Quran. It will be revealed in this manner. Rest assured, its collection and recital, all is our responsibility. So when we recite it at that time, follow that recital of it. Then upon us is to explain it for you wherever need be. So Ustaz Ghamidi says that as far as these verses are concerned, they are absolutely clear in the fact that the Quran was something that was collected and finalized in the times of Prophet Muhammad. How? We shall just see. So he says that if you look at these two verses, some of the points that are absolutely evident are that firstly, the Prophet has been told that the way the Quran is being revealed piecemeal to him, which means in small portions, in installments, they are done so keeping in view the circumstances. and this is the correct way of revelation, and he should not worry about its protection and collection and arrangement. A new recital will ensue after this chronological one. So, summa inna alayna, as the Quran says, فَإِذَا قَرَأْنَاهُ فَاتَّبِعْ قُرْآنَ. So when we read it again, you will follow that new recital. So it actually means that after this revelation that took place in its historical sequence, its chronological sequence, it would be reread in another sequence. And at that time, if the Almighty intends to revoke something on the basis of His wisdom, He will do so, and then have the Prophet read it in a manner that he will not forget any part of it, and the Quran will be consigned to him in its final form, which will remain protected. So we just read that verse, سَنُقْرِئُكَ فَلَا تَنْسَى, that he will have the Quran read out, and the Quran read to the Prophet. The Prophet will read it out in a manner that he will not forget any part of it. فَلَا تَنْسَى إِلَّا مَا شَاءَ اللَّهُ. He will not forget it except what God wills. So this is the first premise that he draws from these two verses. Second, he says that this final recital would take place once the Quran has been arranged in the form of a book, and simultaneously he would be bound to follow this recital in future. He would then not be allowed to read the Quran according to its previous recital. So the historical recital or the chronological recital would be rearranged or given a new shape, and that would be the final recital, and the Prophet would be bound, and of course the rest of the Ummah, to read this final new arrangement of the Quran and not the previous one. Thirdly, Ustaz says that it was told that if the application of a Quranic directive needed explanation, it would be done so at this second recital, the final recital. And in this manner, this book would stand completed in every way after collection and arrangement and explanation by the Almighty Himself. So if any question would arise regarding any part, the Almighty has said, Inna alayna bayana, it is my responsibility or our responsibility to have this explained. Now, this second or the final recital is also termed as the Al-Arda Al-Akhira, which is the final presentation, and it is evident from various ahadith, various narratives, that each year Gabriel would read out the Quran revealed in that year to the Prophet. The Quran that was revealed in that year to the Prophet during the month of Ramadan. And in the last year, which is the year after the Ramadan, after which the Prophet died, this Al-Arda Akhira, he read out the Quran in this Al-Arda Akhira twice. He read it out to him twice. And for this we have a record also of a narrative. So it says that each year the Quran would be read out to the Prophet once. However, the year he died, it was read out to him twice. So in the year he died, it was actually read out to him twice. The Prophet used to read the Quran on this recital until he died. After him, the rightly guided caliphs and all the companions from among the Muhajirun and the Ansar would read the Quran on this recital. There was no difference in this regard between them. Later, it was this recital which was called Al-Qira'atul Amma. Qira'atul Amma, which means the second recital or the rearrangement of the Quran. The way it was read out and recited was called the Al-Qira'atul Amma, which means the reading of the masses. And Abu Abdurrahman as-Sulami, a Tabi'i, a follower who died in 73 Hijrah, he actually reports a very phenomenal thing in this regard. I'm just going to read out his text. He says that the reading of Abu Bakr, Umar, Usman and Zaid, the reading of course refers to the recital, the way the words are. The reading of Abu Bakr, Umar, Usman and Zaid ibn Sabit, and that of all the Muhajirun and the Ansar was the same. They would read the Quran according to the Al-Qira'atul Amma. This is the same reading which was read out twice by the Prophet to Gabriel in the year of his death. Zayd ibn Sabit was also present in this reading called the Al-Arda Al-Akhira. It was this very reading that he taught the Quran to people until his death. So Abu Abdurrahman as-Sulmi, of course, is someone who has described this fact that the reading that we have today, there was absolutely no difference. There was no question of any multiple readings. The Ansar, the Muhajirun, which of course constituted the whole Ummah at that time, they had the same reading, and that was called the Qira'atul Amma, and it was the same reading, as Abu Abdurrahman says, that on which the Quran was read out in the times of the Prophet in the last Ramadan twice. So there is absolutely no difference in this regard. So it is only this recital which possesses oral tawatur from the time of the companions to date. So remember, in our earlier sessions, we had discussed that how the Quran has been transmitted, and the transmission that we call tawatur, which means concurrent, perpetual translation, that a whole generation transmits the Quran to the next generation, and so on and so forth, in such large numbers that any error in this regard is rendered absolutely impossible. So we have to understand that this oral tawatur is only a trait, a characteristic of this Qiraatul Amma. No other reading, yes, those readings are found in our Qiraat books, in our Hadith books, in our Fiqh books, but none of these readings possess oral tawatur as this reading possesses. So as far as the Quran is concerned, we have already discussed that one of its traits is that it possesses this tawatur, which means generation to generation transfer, which actually is a mode through which certain things or certainty is achieved, certitude is achieved in transmission. Only the Quran has this, and this reading has it. However, our scholars derive the technical subtleties of this recital from the riwayah of Hafs. And we call this Qiraatul Amma. It has been erroneously classified as the riwayah of Hafs. Hafs bin Sulaiman obviously is a famous Qari of the Quran. And it is for this reason that scholars call it the reading of Hafs. And that is why it has become famous by this name. Thus, it is thought that like other readings, this reading is his ikhtiyar. So, ikhtiyar, of course, means that these scholars of reading, they had the authority to choose between various riwayahs that came to them. However, it is actually Al-Qiraatul Amma, and classical scholars, as pointed out, have just introduced it in this name. So, we know that Abu Abdurrahman al-Sulami calls it by this name. Another quotation in this regard that Ustaz Ghamidi has cited, of course, is something that has been stated by Suyuti, and he says, the reading on which the Quran was read out to the Prophet in the year of his death is the same according to which people are reading the Quran today. So, al-qiraat allati uridat ala nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam fil aam allazi qubiza fihi fil qira'ah hiya al-qiraatul amma yaqra'uha or yuqri'uha an-nas al-yawm or yaqra'uha an-nas al-yawm, which means that people are reading the Quran in the same way, and this is something which Suyuti has cited in his Al-Itqan. So, if the Quran is deliberated upon in the light of its coherence and arrangement and its internal evidence, of course from within the context, it also pronounces this very judgment. And the work which has been done by the scholars of the Farai school, of course, including Ustaz Ghamidi and then his two illustrious predecessors, Ustaz Farahi and Islahi, on the Quran, it speaks volumes on that the text of the Quran does not accept these variant readings. A person can see examples of this at many instances, and then Ustaz Ghamidi actually cites Tadabbur-e-Quran, and this citation from Tadabbur-e-Quran is something that gives us this understanding that differences in variant readings have also been resolved in this commentary. So this is what Ustaz Islahi, Ghamidi's teacher, is writing, and Ustaz Ghamidi is actually citing him. He says that differences in variant readings have also been resolved in this commentary. The conventional and mutawatir reading is only the one on which the Quran has been written, which we have in our hands. So this is something that Ustaz Islahi has said in this regard. But now a question may arise, of course, on this premise as well, and that is that there is a narrative which is the famous narrative of 7 ahruf, which might cause some confusion to some people in this regard. And this again is a narrative that is very, very famous, and Ustaz Ghamidi cites one of his texts, which is reported by Abdul Rahman ibn Abdul Qari. So the text is that Abdul Rahman ibn Abdul Qari narrated, Umar ibn al-Khattab, and before me I heard Hisham ibn Hakim ibn Hizam reading Surah Fatiha in a different way from the one I used to read it. And the Prophet himself had read out this surah to me. So consequently, as soon as I heard him, I wanted to get hold of him. However, I gave him respite until he had finished the prayer. Then I got hold of his cloak and dragged him to the Prophet. I said to him, I have heard this person, Hisham ibn Hakim ibn Hizam, reading Surah Furqan in a different way from the one you had read it out to me. The Prophet said, leave him alone, O Umar. Then he said to Hisham, read it. Umar said, he read it out in the same way as he had done earlier. At this the Prophet said, it was revealed thus. Then the Prophet asked me to read it out. So I read it out. At this, he said, it was revealed thus. This Quran has been revealed in 7 ahruf. You can read it in any of them you find easy from among them. So now the question arises that if this is the stature of the Quran, that there is absolutely no possibility of any other reading, but then there is a narrative, a very, very famous narrative of that is recorded by many hadith books, and most hadith books I would say, including Bukhari. It says that this narrative is something that may cast aspersions on what has been just said, that if Surah Furqan was read to Hisham bin Hakim bin Hizam, as this narrative says, in a different way from what the Prophet read it out to Umar radhiyallahu anhu himself, and then when Umar actually took Hisham ibn Hakim ibn Hizam to the presence of the Prophet, and he said that, well, he's reading Surah Furqan in a different way, which means it has different words. And the way you taught it to me had different words. And when the Prophet asked him, which is Hisham bin Hakim, to recite it, he did so. And Umar said that he did in the same way as he had done to me, but that was different from what I had in my own memory. And then the Prophet asked Umar to recite it out, and Umar said that I did so the way I remembered it. But the Prophet also corroborated this. Both were different, but Prophet said, Hakaza unzila, that this is also correct. And then he said that the Quran has been revealed in 7 ahruf, or on 7 ahruf, and you can read in any one of these ahruf that you find it easy. So I'm leaving this discussion here. I'm going to talk about Ustaz's criticism on this hadith, inshallah, in the next session. But just to summarize what we have discussed today, that as far as the authority of the Quran is concerned, it is the final authority, and in spite of it being the final authority, then there are questions that do arise because of the literature that is available. The first of these questions is about the variant readings. Then we have the question on the univocal nature of the Quran, whether it has multiple understandings, or the speculative nature of the words, which means that the words convey is not something definitive, and people, words don't have the authority to convey the meanings that they hold. So this is the second thing which raises that question. The third is regarding the muhkam and mutashabihat verses, and the fourth is regarding the ahadith that we will also study later on, which seemingly contradict the Quran, or they have a different understanding as against the Quran. So all these 4 questions have been raised by him, and then we have started to study the first of these questions, and which is the multiple or the variant readings of the Quran, about which Ustaz Ghamidi has posited that there is absolutely no possibility of any reading which is different or from the one that we know today. It's called Qira'atul Amma, and as far as this reading is concerned, it is solely the one that occupies or has the stature of tawatur, which means generation to generation transfer. All the others are ahad, which means they're isolate and reported by a few individuals, and they cannot in any way be called the Quran. So this is something that he has surmised from a verse of the Quran of Surah Qiyamah. And in fact, if I can elaborate a little more, I can tell you that he has drawn heavily from his predecessors, Ustaz Farahi and Islahi, both. Ustaz Farahi, in fact, is the first person to point out that these Surah Qiyamah verses, Inna alayna jamahu wa Qur'ana, are verses that speak of the actually the whole scheme of the revelation of the Quran. It's how it would be recorded and how it would be reread after its chronological revelation. And that second revelation would be the one that would be that the Prophet would require to read, and that is what is called the Qira'atul Amma. And then we saw Abu Abdul Rahman al-Sulami saying that it was on this Al-Arza al-Akhira, the final reading, the Qira'atul Amma, on which all the Muhajirun and the Ansar read the Quran, and it was the same reading which the Prophet was read out to in the last Ramadan. So this shows that there was absolutely no difference, and if there was any difference, it arose later. But finally, another question that arose, which we will inshallah tackle in our next session, but I've just introduced the whole issue to you, is that a very famous hadith says that Surah Furqan was read in one way to Hisham bin Hakim bin Hizam, and in another way to Umar. And Umar could not reconcile this in his mind. When he saw Hisham bin Hakim reading this surah in the prayer, it struck him, and he was actually mortified that how could Surah Furqan, that he remembers in a different way, be read out in another way by Hisham. So he took Hisham to the Prophet's presence, and the Prophet actually corroborated both readings. He asked Umar and Hisham both to read their versions. Both of them read their versions, and the Prophet said both are correct. In fact, he said that Quran is revealed on 7 ahruf. So this is again a hadith which now is of course something that needs to be looked into more deeply and more critically, which inshallah we'll do in our next session. And for the moment, if you have any questions on what we have just studied, please raise them.
Thank you very much, Dr. Saleem. Our first question asks, Quran declares itself as Furqan, then why is it that the Muslim Ummah was divided on the basis of a belief called Imamat derived from the Quran itself?
So you see, there has to be some, we have to understand there's one thing which is called the text of the Quran, and there's another thing which is called how people understand it. So the Quran, the way we know it, it gives us that one definitive meaning. It is the final authority. But it's not necessary that every one single person reaches the same conclusion. So this is not what the Quran is claiming. It says that it is the final authority, but to reach that final authority, you have to reflect on the words, you have to reflect on the stature and the context and the section that you are studying. Otherwise, you might draw wrong conclusions. So if a person or a group of people have drawn a whole philosophy of imamat from the Quran, and it is different from some of the other scholars who don't agree with it, it is just a question of looking at the arguments of both and then deciding. So this in no way undermines the authority. So the Quranic authority is not that it's going to force someone to accept its view. The Quran is going to present one meaning, but it does not guarantee that you reach that meaning. It could be because of some shortcoming that you never were able to reach that meaning. So that is why we say that if there is a difference of opinion, then in this regard, the opinions which has the backing of your intellect, which is most sound, is going to be accepted. So in other words, what is being said here is that the multiplicity of understanding of a single Quranic verse, it does not mean that it does not negate in any way that it only has one meaning. Because you see, that one meaning was the intent of God. But to reach that meaning, the person, of course, will have to understand it. And while understanding the text, not at all times his mind is present. At times there is a lack of reflection, and at times it is a lack of knowledge itself. And this is precisely what Ustaz Farahi has also once said, that the reason that why people don't reach the same understanding regarding the same verse is because of the level of intellect or the level of reflection might vary from person to person. But this in no way undermines the fact that the Quran does not have a single meaning. It does not mean the Quran has multiple meanings or a verse has multiple meanings. It only means that people are somehow, not getting to the real meaning, because God intended one meaning. And because of a lack of reflection or a lack of understanding, it could be many other extraneous factors. It could be the fact that people start understanding the Quran through hadith. They don't directly deliberate on the Quran. And of course, there are other external influences as well, because of which they fail to reach the correct understanding.
Thank you very much for that, Dr. Saleem. The next question asks, why didn't Allah reveal the Quran in a more understandable manner if He already knew that in the future there'd be misconceptions?
I think this was a test of our intellect. The Almighty Himself has created this world on the principle of test and trial. So the test of understanding a text itself is a part of our intellectual understanding and test. So it gives us that intellectual challenge to understand the Quran in a deep way, in a way that you are able to go and find out the purport. So it's not like a bland statement. It's not like the Quran is not prose the way we are used to prose, and it's easy to understand prose. It has its own depth of meaning, and that depth itself actually is something that attracts brilliant minds to reflect on it. So had it been a very simple exposition, brilliant minds would never have been attracted by it. So you see, the brilliance of the Quran is that it is equally appealing to a general reader, which just draws a simple message, and it also has a lot of things to offer for the deep thinker, for an advanced reader. And that is why, and that advancement, of course, is something that forms a part of our trial as well, that how deep we understand the Quran and how correctly we do so. So it seems to us, of course, this is a question that has to be addressed to God, that why he chose this mode. But to my view or my understanding, it seems that it was meant to be an intellectual challenge for us.
Thank you very much, Dr. Saleem. I'd like to remind the participants that if you have any questions, you can raise your hand or post your questions in the chat. And to raise your hand, you can click on the react button and click on raise hand. So the next question asks, is it difference of dialect in the two qira'at between the North African version and the common one in the rest of the world, or is the difference in terms of the content?
The content does change. I just gave you an example. Arjulakum and Arjulakum, if you read it in a different way, the meaning will change. So what I can say is that, there are verses which, when read the way these variations exist, they change the meaning of the verses as well. But I would say a very large part does not change the meaning. A very large part is mostly either synonymous, words that are used are synonymous, or very close to being synonyms. But yes, there are instances. I gave you one example. Another example occurs in the inheritance verses between UC and USA. That's another technical difference that I have explained in our analytical study of the Quran series, in which USA and UC are the two readings of the same word, but they make a drastic change in meaning. And similarly, yukhadi'una, yakhda and khada'a, the way they are used in different cases of verbs, that's another example. So subtle change does occur, and besides the subtle change, we have also some blatant changes in meaning when these readings are accepted. So that is why it is essential that we just stick to the Qira'atul Amma, and that Qira'atul Amma is something which is the only certain reading that has been handed down from the Prophet, and that is what is called Al-Qira'atul Amma.
So would you say that it's fair to surmise that because of the difference in the dialect, you're getting the difference in the content between these two?
It's not the dialect. Dialect is something that does not change the word, because you see, it's like just the fact that it's like a local pronunciation of a word. The alphabets, actually, the words, they change. You see, the word itself, for example, another example that comes to my mind immediately is the difference between singular and plural. So if you look at Surah Tahrim, which is the 66th verse, Surah of the Quran, right near the end of it, we have the words وَصَدَّقَتْ بِكَلِمَاتِ رَبِّهَا وَكُتُبِهِ, that Mary actually, صَدَّقَتْ بِكَلِمَاتِ رَبِّهَا, she corroborated the words of the Almighty, وَكُتُبِهِ, and His books. So this is the Qira'atul Amma. But if you read some of the other versions, you'll find the word kitab. Instead of kutub, it will say kitab. So kutub, of course, is a plural, which means she testified to the books of God. And if you look at the other version, it says she testified to the book of God, which means it's a singular. So we have singular and plural differences. We have case differences, which means a verb might change, like tahharna or tatahharna. And similarly, we have differences in letters as well. For example, you'll find a va and a fa replaced by each other many a time in many readings. But if you look at in these readings in more detail, then the scholars of the variant readings, they have put forth certain standards of acceptability of certain readings. So that's another discussion that's a little more technical. But for all intents and purposes, I can say that once you open this door, that the Quran has variant readings, then this is a door, once opened, it can seriously cause a lot of damage to the authority of the Quran, because now it's open. And there have been scholars in our Ummah who think that we can even read the Quran according to our own ijtihad, which means that we can make sense of these Arabic letters and give them the i'rab or the declensions that are more suitable, or they are more suited to a context in our own understanding. So, for example, Zamakhshari, a very famous commentator of the Quran, he is convinced that we can even read the Quran on the basis of ijtihad, which means we can change the declensions, we can change the i'rab. So ya'lamun can become ta'lamun, just to give an example. So whatever would make more sense to a competent authority, he can actually read it that way. So that is what his view was, and there are other people who also subscribe to his view. So once this whole chapter is opened, it's like it's like a window. If you open it, it's just going to let everything into it, and then the whole text of the Quran will become a fluid one, and you'll not be able to decide that what word actually was originally. Because you see, the way the Arabic language is, it has dots and it has declensions. So these dots, which are called diacritic marks, because of the fact that these diacritic marks, they determine the shape of the word. So the diacritic marks, if they are two at the top, it becomes a ta, and if there is one at the bottom, it becomes a ba. So because of the fact that people do claim that many of our manuscripts of the Quran, they were without these diacritics and these declensions, so there were instances in which people read out in a way that was different to the oral reading of the Quran. And again, that has something which has caused these multiple readings, I would say. But yes, this is an issue. If it is accepted, then then the fact that the Quran is the final authority, that is something that will be seriously challenged, and in fact, it will be nullified, I would say. So that is why it is very important to either accept. If you think that the Quran has variant readings, then you have to come up with an answer to the fact that how can the Quran be called the final authority and then still have variant readings? Because if you have variant readings of the same verse, you can never decide on a definitive meaning, because you'll have many readings or more than one reading of that verse. So not only that, but as I said, in practice also, in practicality as well, scholars, Ustaz Farahi, Ustaz Islahi, Ghamidi, Ustaz Ghamidi, they have tried, they have presented their works and said that if you look at the Quran in the way they have presented and explained it, the variant readings, if you try to insert them or try to interpret the Quran through them, the Quran itself will just throw it out. It just not accept these readings because they will not make sense. So all in all, this is like a more of a claim that may sound at this instance, but if you have to see its proof, as they say, the proof of the pudding lies in its eating. So the best way would be to go through the works of these celebrated authorities.
Thank you very much for that clarification, Dr. Saleem Akram. Please go ahead.
अस्सलाम सर।
वालेकुम अस्सलाम।
सर वर्ष में और जो वर्ष की रवाया की रेसिटेशन है और हाउस की, उसमें कई जगह पर तो वो जो एड्रेस है वो चेंज है, सेकंड पर्सन टू थर्ड पर्सन। हमारे यहाँ या मलून है तो वहाँ ताबलून लिखा, अभी आपने जिक्र किया या मलून ताबलून, तो फर्क पड़ जाएगा ना कि वो थर्ड पर्सन से बात हो रही है, सेकंड पर्सन से बात हो रही है, तो इसको किस तरह आप रिजॉल्व करेंगे?
I think the answer that we have given is that we will not accept any other reading except the Qira'atul Amma. And it is Hafs, which is the Qira'atul Amma. It has been erroneously called as the reading of Hafs. Its real name is the Al-Qira'atul Amma. So, and it is the only reading which has tawatur. So, as far as the reading of Warsh is concerned, who is actually a student of Nafi, they are all ahad. They have not been transferred to tawatur, and they don't have any status. Anything which is not mutawatir, anything which is not has the characteristic of tawatur, cannot be accepted. So this is not what our scholars generally do. They equate both these readings. They would regard the Warsh and the Hafs versions to be equal. But according to Ustaz Ghamidi's understanding, that what we have just understood, that the Quran has just one reading which has that tawatur, and that is the reading of Hafs, which is of course not the right name. The right name is Al-Qira'atul Amma, but it has been erroneously dubbed as the reading of Hafs, because Hafs did not use his ikhtiyar or selection, which other qaris did, and he read it the way he received it, and in the dialect and in the lahja of the Arabs.
I asked a friend of mine who's from Morocco, because when I found this out, I went on Google and found out the differences. So I asked a friend of mine who's in Morocco to bring his Quran Pak, because I thought somebody just played with it on the internet. But he brought the Quran. I have a copy of it. It still has those mostly the difference of the nukat, नुक्ते नीचे पड़े हुए हैं, ऊपर पड़े हुए हैं, ये कोई लफ्ज चेंज नहीं है. So नुकात का फिर तो I understood myself that maybe because these diacritic marks were
not present.
Were not original. They were.
So that's what I said, that this is one of the reasons of these variant readings. But you see, our traditional scholars, they justify this and say that, well, this is not by any accidental purpose. It is something that was designed. So by design, it is said that the original manuscripts of the Quran were devoid of diacritics, so that the variant readings could be accommodated in them. I mean, if the dots and the declensions had been inserted, then they would have had just one reading. So they claim that the Quran was left bare, bereft of declensions and diacritics, so that different readings that already exist according to them, all of them could be read through in the text, inserted and then read through the text. So that is what our traditional scholars believe. But as I just pointed out, that the Farai school, or the way we approach the understanding of the Quran, we don't agree with this point of view, that the Quran has multiple readings and that the Quran was bereft of these diacritics or of these declensions. What we actually say is that this could be true, that some of the manuscripts might not have had all these declension diacritics, but you see, originally the Quran was transmitted through orality, through oral transfer, and that oral transfer itself was then put to the pen by actually designating the sounds, the way we spell them, and then using those sounds to actually insert those diacritics. So it does not mean, I mean, in any way that if the Quran or the original Qurans were without any diacritics, then the reason was that all other readings could be accommodated. No, that was just a style which the Arabs adopted, because they knew that the original way in which the Quran was being preserved is not through writing it out, but through reading it out. So thousands and thousands of people read it out in the same way, and thousands and thousands, and in fact later on it became a large number, they heard it in the same way, and then into the next generation they transferred it. And it was like at the top there was a pyramid, and we know that when the Prophet passed away, so there is a rough estimate that there was about 100,000 people who he left behind. Not all of them were Sahaba, but it is said that the count between the people that he left behind was somewhere between 60,000 and 120,000. So all these people were narrating the Quran, they were transmitting the Quran in the same way, and they did so to the next generation, which on its own then did so to the next generation. And right from the Prophet up to our own generation, this process has been continuing, and there has not been any break in this process. And each generation is actually increasing in number, and as I said, it's like a pyramid, and the down you go, you'll expand even more. And the top of that pyramid was, of course, the generation of the Sahaba, and they too were in so large a number that when they transferred the Quran to the Tabi'un, which was the next generation, it was rendered free of any multiplicity or any discrepancy, because it was the same reading that was being transferred. So in our understanding, manuscript evidence is a secondary way of transmission. Yes, it later became at par with the oral transmission once the diacritics had been inserted, but before these diacritics had been inserted, or these declensions had been fully inserted, it was that oral transmission that formed the real means of transmission, and in that there was no error.
How can we correct these thousands of people, or maybe hundreds of thousands of people in those countries? I know only of one of them, like Morocco, but this other.
But Asin, if you would like to read more about it, so because my own doctoral thesis and my postdoctoral work is exactly on this topic, so I would advise you to look up. I have not brought it up here because that would prolong the discussion. I have given very detailed lectures on this topic, and have shown that how the Moroccan reading actually originated in the 3rd century, and that was because of a order. It's like a royal decree that was implemented, and Imam Malik, the person whose fiqh was followed by the people of North Africa. So at one time it was said that because Nafi was also a student or teacher in one sense of Imam Malik, because Imam Malik was his teacher in Hadith, he taught him Muwatta, and Nafi was actually his teacher in the Quran, and he taught him his own reading. So because Imam Malik fiqh was adopted in North Africa, so people surmised that we should also adopt his reading, and his reading was that of Nafi's reading. And that is how in 252 Hijrah is the exact date in which, through a royal decree, the reading of Imam Nafi was implemented, and it is that reading which we know today as the reading of Warsh, because Warsh was one of his students. So this whole history has been surmised in my work. You can look it up, or you can look up the lectures that I have given, and
What's the name of your book, sir?
it's called History of the Quran, a Critical Study.
I have that. I'll look up. But they claim that they also claim that, like you said, that the original originally the whole Meccan area, Medina area, especially Medina, this Riwaya verse was recited.
That's not correct. I mean, what I've shown in my book, that this is something that has become very famous, but the more famous it is, the more farther it is from the truth, because this never happened. That, for example, Ibn Kasir, about whom it is said that he was the Qari of Makkah and Nafi was the Qari of Medina, it never happened that it was never ever recorded in history that these readings were read there and then they were replaced by the reading of Hafs in some later period of time. Because had this happened, this would not have would not have gone unnoticed, and people would have said that, oh, now the reading of the Quran has changed in this area. So never ever did it happen that in Makkah or Medina these readings changed. What actually happened was that scholars who actually subscribed to these readings, they had their own circles of students, and when they moved, those students went with them and some of them stayed behind. So people who were reading with those students just had that difference. So as far as the common masses were concerned, they never bothered, because they were reading the Quran, the Qiraatul Amma. All that this concerned to or related to were the scholars who would subscribe to those multiple readings. At times they would teach a particular reading in a particular territory, then they would move to another territory, and with them that Qiraat will also move. But at the same time, because a few students might be left behind, they would continue with his teaching and that would be left. So basically it was in these scholarly circles that these readings became popular. As far as the masses are concerned, they never bothered and they were always with the Qiraatul Amma. So these are a lot of details. I mean, I've oversimplified certain facts. But as I said, if you need a detailed answer, I have given several talks on this, and also, as I said, written this book in which you'll find, hopefully, the answers.
I have that book. I'll try to read it. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Abdurrahman, please go ahead.
Assalamu alaikum, sir.
Walaikum.
Sir, regarding the Quran, when it's the word of God, why is it left to the interpretation of his flawed slaves? Like you mentioned that maybe I'm understanding it wrong. Syntax, morphology, and lexicography are not definitive. So how are we understanding with this Zanni tools?
So this is a question that we will be tackling in our next session. We have just raised the question. It's not that we are agreeing with what it is being said. So this is a question that has been raised by Imam Razi. He is an exponent of a whole category of scholars, and the way he has presented it is the way we have just recited it out to you so that you can see how he presents it. The critique on this answer is yet to come. So we'll tackle this inshallah in future.
All right. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much. Adil Qureshi, please go ahead.
Sir, Assalamu alaikum, sir.
Walaikum.
The difference between Maliki Yawmiddin and Maliki Yawmiddin, is there a difference between their meaning, or is it just the pronunciation of the same word?
There's a difference between their meanings. So Malik is a master, and Malik is the king. So of course there is a nuanced difference, but there is a difference.
And only one of them is correct.
Of course.
You cannot say that about.
No, we cannot, because the Maliki Yawmiddin does not have tawatur. It does not possess that tawatur. It's the reading of Nafi, in fact. So Nafi read it as Maliki Yawmiddin, but the reading that is what we call the Qiraatul Amma is Maliki Yawmiddin.
Right, sir. And so just follow up to your question about, I think, Harkat and Nukte, which are called as declinations and diacritics. So Nukat, I understand. When somebody is saying Lisan and when somebody is saying Leban, I know that there is a sin and not a ba. But the Arabs did not usually used to say these harakat, right? They used to say them out sakin. They would not say lisanu or lisana or lisani. They would simply say lisan. So how did these declinations also got transferred through oral tradition?
So you see, declensions they were transmitted because it is the way that we know that the Quran is read out. So even though that there was a silence, there is a silent at the end of each declension, but the way the Quran was read out by Gabriel in the last Arza al-Akhira is something that made it very clear that wherever the reading is silent, if you are going to if you're going to not read out, pronounce it, then it would be made evident that what exactly was the shape of the declension. Was it kitabun, kitaban, or kitabin, for example? Because of course, if it had been kitaban, kitabun, kitabin, and kitabun, all three have a different different vocal, different voice. So that would be transmitted itself. So these readings, we have to understand, they were read with this, with these details, that if there was any chance of any confusion in any part, that was immediately rectified or immediately communicated. And in fact, if you go even back, further back, you'll see that this is how the Prophet actually recited to his companions, and then the companions would record these readings also, although there was no official recording. I mean, there was no official codex, but they would write it down. And then we do have instances in history in which it is said that once that was written down, the people who wrote it down would come to the Prophet and say that this is how I have understood, and they would repeat what they had said. On some occasion, the Prophet would correct them also and say that, well, you've not understood correctly, or you've not heard correctly. This is not what I said, this is what I said. So we have these correction or instances in which at times these corrections were made. But as I said, primarily it was the oral nature that was the crux, or the basic nature through which the Quran was transmitted.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, Dr. Saleem. Last question that we have so far asks, after all of this, how can we say that the Quran is safe from any change?
So let us wait for the next session. I mean, at the moment we have just raised some questions and we have started to answer them. And inshallah, in the next session, we will be giving more details that how these variant readings originated, and at the same time, how we can be absolutely sure that the reading that we are, acclimatized to, or we are exposed to, is the right one. So just give us a little more time. But in the meantime, what you can do is read the verdict of the Quran on itself. So it says, "Inna alayna jama'ahu wa Qur'ana," which means that the Almighty says, I am going to correct this Quran, which is being revealed to you piecemeal, give it a new arrangement, and then you will read the Quran in that new arrangement. And the Almighty Himself said that I am not going to give the Quran by writing it down to you, I am going to read it out to you. Of course, that meant that on His behalf, Gabriel read it out to the Prophet. So the Prophet heard it orally. So remember, the first step, or the first ladder, or the first rung of that ladder was the Prophet hearing from Gabriel, not the Prophet recording something from Gabriel. And that is still today the real means of preservation of the Quran, that it was orally transmitted. Today also it's orally transmitted, and in fact all published versions of the Quran, or all written versions of the Quran today, they need to be actually corroborated by a hafiz or a memorizer who says that, yes, I have read through this written version, and I can corroborate that this is how I also memorized it, and what you have written is exactly a replica of my memorization. So even today, written versions, they need the corroboration of that oral tradition. So such is the in-depth nature. Of course, this is something we will discuss in more detail in our next session, but just to give you this assurance that a tremendous arrangement was made for this preservation, and that arrangement in fact is continuing even today. So if all the Qurans that we have published or written, they just vanish by the stroke of some magical spell, so to speak, even then the Quran is going to be preserved, because it does not depend on any external instrument like writing. It is basically that oral thing which is now found in the minds of so many thousands of people who have memorized it.
Thank you very much, Dr. Saleem. One last question. This one asks, do all the 7 pronunciation styles maintain the proper translation?
I would still again give you the answer that let us look at those 7 styles in our next session. There are no, as I said, this is what is being claimed by scholars, that they have 7 styles. It's not that all of them claim the same thing. It's not that this 7 ahruf actually refers to 7 styles or it refers to 7 readings. We will take a closer look at this narrative and see that how it has been wrongly understood, and it does not refer in any way to any of the understandings or the conventional understanding. In fact, one of our very prominent authorities like Imam Suyuti has said that the most appropriate understanding of this narrative is that it is from among the mutashabihat, the meaning of which is known to none, which means that there is something missing, or something that has been wrongly reported in this narrative, because the way it has been reported does not make any sense. And we will look at that in detail as well.
Thank you very much, Dr. Saleem, for another wonderful session, and inshallah we'll see you tomorrow.